Day week. Men, it's Tuesday. Keep that in mind. We still got 48 hours to get it together. There were two husbands that were eating lunch together, and one said to the other one, he said, you know, next week is Valentine's Day. And the other husband said, yeah, I know. And he said, he was asked, he said, well, have you got your wife anything? He said, oh yeah, I've already taken care of it. He said, I bought her a belt and a coordinating bag. And the other husband said, wow, I'm impressed. That's kind of romantic. And the other husband said, yeah, I really do think that's going to repair the vacuum cleaner. So man, do better than that. Do better than that. I was once told, I heard a speaker say one time, if it has an electrical cord to it, you have to plug it in. It is not a gift. It is not a gift. In fact, I think that's a word from the Lord, probably in Haggai somewhere. So y'all got to get it right now on Tuesday. You know, last week we opened up the book of Haggai and kind of made a little humor that it's a tough book to find in the Bible, and it's one of the brief books that we have in the Old Testament. Anyway, the context of last week was that a faithful remnant had gone out of exile, gone back to Jerusalem, and begun to kind of rebuild the city and make life happen there. They'd been there about 10, 15 years, and they had great houses and had done many other things, but there was one thing that they had not done, and that is that they had done nothing to rebuild God's temple. Nothing. And God raised up the prophet Haggai to speak a word to them, a word of instruction. And again, it isn't that God was interested in brick and mortar, but he was deeply concerned about what that represented. That because they had not begun to even rebuild the temple, that it was symbolic of the fact that they were not tending to their spiritual life, which was, of course, the key to their identity as being God's people. And so that's kind of where we were last week, and God said you need to go into the hills, you need to cut some trees, you need to haul the lumber down, and you need to get busy. And so the context this morning is that they started rebuilding the temple, and they had been at it about a month, and then discouragement set in. Discouragement set in. All of us have experienced discouragement, have we not? You know, and in a variety of ways, on many levels, a variety of things, but all of us know what it is to just be discouraged, to be depleted, to feel like throwing in the towel, giving up, and just maybe moving on to something else. And so again, while these folks may be far removed from us in history and in time, the emotion that they were feeling is not. It's very real. It's very modern. It's very us. Because all of us can connect with and identify with discouragement. So what I want us to do this morning is to look again from the book of Haggai to see how did God minister to these folks in the midst of their discouragement. Because if we can kind of see that and receive that, then it reminds us that God ministers to us in the midst of our discouragement as well, in the same and mighty and profound ways that he did to his people over 2 millennia ago. So Haggai chapter 1, beginning there in verse 13, then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of people. So God has moved in the political leader, the religious leader, and the entire people. So basically everybody's covered. He has stirred their spirit. And sometimes, you know, that needs to happen to us as well, does it not? God needs to stir us. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty their God on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. Now, that lets us know that we've got a very specific point in time. We've got a month and a day and a year here that the writer Haggai is giving to us to let us know as the reader exactly when they began to do the work. Well, on the 21st day of the 7th month, so about a month later, give or take a day or two, The word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to the governor of Judah, to the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem like nothing? But now be strong, declares the Lord, and work, for I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. And I skip to verse 9. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. So again, God steps in, using his prophet Haggai to speak to his people in a very down moment. In a very down moment. Again, they had been at this for about a month, and it just wasn't looking good. It just wasn't looking good. They began to get discouraged about the whole project. In this passage, we find two root causes of discouragement that God is going to address. Now, these aren't the only causes of discouragement, but I think once we explore them, we will realize that many times they are the causes, on occasion, of the discouragement that we experience. But we have two root causes that are kind of fleshed out here that are holding the people back. One cause, the first cause, is comparisons. Comparisons. You know, nothing can discourage us more than when you and I get into that practice of comparing ourselves, our situation, our circumstances with someone else's, which of course is always better, always more glorious, always more successful, and then discouragement sets in. Probably the most obvious example is, if you ever tried to kind of lose a little weight, tone it up, and get in shape, I know I have. I still work at it. I still work at it. My wife's got me going to a thing at Tanglewood called PlayFit. Now that is completely misnamed. There's nothing play about it. But I go on Tuesdays and Fridays and Sunday afternoons. And we do rope slams, and we do sit-ups, and we do tire flips, and all of this kind of stuff for about 50 minutes, with little 30-second water breaks thrown in. And the other day, you know, I'm there, and I weigh on the scales, and I'm trying to make things look a little toned and all that kind of stuff. And so the other day, in comes a young lady, probably about 30 years old, and she's got about 1% body fat. Y'all with me? And she comes in her little spandex and her little workout uniform and her hot pink shoelaces on her, you know, nice-looking tennis shoes, and she's bouncy, 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 you know, all around, and, you know, so on and so forth. And so anyway, her hair looks great, her makeup's perfect, and so I think, okay, well, we'll see what it looks like after 50 minutes of tire flipping and rope slamming and sit-ups and push-ups and all that good stuff. So anyway, the 45-50-minute thing comes to its conclusion, and that's about the time I go around the PlayFit, start picking myself up. You know, my knees over in that corner, and my stomach's over here in this corner, so I have to go around and kind of put myself back together. You know what I'm saying? And we always end with these ab workouts where I'm just kind of like just completely exhausted and flat on the mat and so on and so forth. So I look around at this 30-something, bouncy, 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 bouncy. I'll see y'all next time. I'll see. People like that are evil. They're evil. They're evil people. Well, if I were to, you know, think, gee, you know, I've been trying this, and then I compare myself with this 1% body fat, and what, you know, that's pretty discouraging stuff. It's pretty discouraging stuff. I remember when I was a young pastor. I've been a pastor for about 26, 27 years, and anyway, some of you all will know what I'm talking about. But at the time that I began my ministry, there was a wonderful pastor in town that had retired. And so he was doing a lot of interim work around and so on and so forth. His name was Harry Gamble. And many of you remember Dr. Gamble. He was years, spent almost his entire career pastoring Calvary Baptist Church. For those of you that don't know Harry Gamble looked like Gregory Peck. He looked like Gregory Peck. Both when Gregory Peck was younger and then Gregory Peck was older, and again, no Harry Gamble. Harry Gamble had this wonderful, just kind of deep bass voice. And it was just, if you were a speaker, and particularly if you were a preacher, man, you just died to have a voice like that. And he would speak slowly, and of course, you know, he'd been a pastor probably 40, 45 years, and so he would turn a phrase and nuance and illustration, and oh my goodness. And I used to tell people, Harry Gamble could open up the phone book and read from it, and people would come to Jesus. Comparisons are a source of discouragement. And that's what we have going on here in Haggai, chapter 1. Because God steps in and he says, I got a question. He says, let me ask you this. How many of you remember the old temple in all its glory? Well, the exile had lasted about 50, 60 years, so there would have been people in this moment of rebuilding the temple who would have keenly remembered the old temple. And how wonderful it looked. And how glorious it was, and how beautiful and ornate it was, and all the hub of activity that occurred there. And so God says, how many of you remember the old temple and all its glory? And now what does in front of you, by comparison, look like? It's his way of getting at the heart of one of the causes of their discouragement. Because, you know, sometimes it's not that we compare ourselves to other people and their circumstances, but sometimes we compare our present to our past, and we think, oh, it was so great back then. Churches do a lot of that. Oh, I remember, you know, and off they go. Comparisons can create discouragement. And so I can imagine in my mind's eye of people standing around looking at some little itty-bitty foundation that had been created after about a month saying, well, this isn't going to be like what we used to have. Well, this isn't big enough. You know, when we used to have that old temple, oh, you know, off they go. Comparisons can be a source of discouragement. Because, see, what often happens is you and I will compare our start with someone else's finish. Just like me comparing my exhaustion and lack of stamina and lack of energy to Miss Bouncy, Bouncy, Bouncy marathoner who had probably been working out for a decade. I'm comparing my start to her finish. And we can make a habit of that. We can make a habit of that. The second cause of discouragement here is lack of progress. Lack of progress. It's kind of implied in the text. You ever feel like you really tried, you really worked hard at something, and but you just don't see any progress, you just don't see any forward movement, just not going well, and man, it's just give up time. You know, it could be financially, it could be in terms of a relationship, it could be in terms of, you know, like a little thing of weight loss or whatever, but you just, you know, you try, you just don't feel or sense any progress, any forward movement, you just think, ah, okay. You know, sometimes that can happen to us spiritually. Sometimes that can happen to us spiritually. Where we think we do all the right things, we show up at all the right places, we sing all the right songs, we read some good Christian books, and yet we just don't sense that there's progress. And so the next thing you know, we kind of let that slide, and let that go, and drop that, and we're comfortably settled in just a mood of discouragement. So those are the two causes of discouragement here in Haggai chapter 1. Again, there are some other causes. But God gives a word of advice, a word of counsel in the midst of this. And it may seem simple, but it's pretty profound. And the two things that God says to his people then, and that God would say to us now in the midst of our own discouragement, whatever form that discouragement may take, and in whatever arena of your life and my life it may dwell, the two pieces of advice are to be strong and to do the work. To be strong and do the work. When God says to his people here, be strong, he doesn't mean physically. But rather, the word that is used here for be strong literally means to determined to grip something so tightly it cannot be taken from you. That is what the image is. That's the language here that is being used by God through his prophet Haggai to encourage the people. Maintain your resolve. Keep your grip. Hang in there. Be strong. And then he says, do the work. And you know, when I think about the work that must have been occurring here in Haggai chapter 1, it would be lay the next stone, lay the next stone, lay the next stone, lay the next stone. Pretty mundane, routine stuff, but do the work. Lay the next stone, lay the next stone. But here's the deal, and here's where this thing gets power. Maintain resolve and do the work, because God says to them, for I am with you. This isn't just pop psychology. This is about them knowing and embracing the presence of God and him being in partnership with them in this task that he has called them to. And you know, when you and I are in the throes of discouragement, the very first place we need to go for the antidote to that is to knowing that God is with you. God is with me. And in the midst of God's presence, he says to us, do the work. Maintain resolve. And I want to leave you with one, I think, powerful thought in regard to that when you and I are in the throes of discouragement. And it is simply this, that successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. And that is so true in many realms of life, but it is so true in the realm of our spiritual life as people of faith. Ted Williams, the great baseball player of the 40s and 50s, who was a tremendous hitter, was once asked by a reporter, said, "You're the only player I watch on a consistent basis that has such a natural ability to hit the ball." And he said back to the reporter, he said, "It is not a natural ability." He says it is after decades of practice. Successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. Tony Rice was the quarterback for the Notre Dame football team when they won the college championship in 1988. At the beginning of the season, folks, sports writers, pundits thought Notre Dame was just going to be average that year because Tony Rice was having arm issues. He just wasn't accurate with his passing. And so they kind of panned Notre Dame. They kind of set Notre Dame to the side early on. What they did not know was that Coach Lou Holtz had told Tony Rice, he had brought to Tony Rice a dartboard and told him, he said, "I want you to throw darts for an hour every day. An hour every day. An hour every day." And so Tony Rice did just that. He threw darts for an hour every day. And his accuracy improved. Successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. Kobe Bryant, one of the great NBA players of all time, had a reputation of showing up at the gym, at the practice arena, at 5 a.m. every day. Didn't make any difference whether anybody else was there or not. He was there at 5 a.m. Practice didn't start until about 8:30 or 9 o'clock for any of the NBA teams that he played with. But he was there at 5 a.m. Do you know that he began the habit of consistently being in the gym at 5 a.m. when he was in high school? Successful people do consistently what other folks do occasionally. Kobe Bryant would stay after practice and he would constantly make shots. And he would keep a tally in his head of all the shots that he had made. And when he reached 400, that's when he'd go home. Successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. You know what? The Bible says something to us, powerful stuff, about the need to be consistent in certain things in our life if we are to become the person that God wants us to become, to do the work. You know, you and I do not stumble in, we do not fall into Christ-likeness. We do not stumble into holiness. God says to us, in the midst of our spiritual discouragement, do the work. Do the work. You want to be a person who has joy, who has a positive perspective? The Apostle Paul wrote the Thessalonians. He said, be joyful always. Successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. Paul said, pray continually. He says, give thanks in all things. Successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. Jesus was asked one time about, how can I be a person of forgiveness? How often do I have to forgive? Jesus knew that if you and I were to truly understand and embrace forgiveness, both the receiving of it and the bestowing of it, we had to then practice forgiveness consistently. And so he said 70 times 7. Forgive consistently, and you'll be a person who then understands and knows the blessedness of forgiveness. Do the work. Do the work. Revelation 21 says, let him who does right continue to do right. And you know, I think what happens to us a lot of times in discouragement, we just want a quick fix. We want to pray to God and just kind of be snapped out of it. Well, God didn't come down in Haggai chapter 1. He could have, but he didn't, and just say, well, here's the temple. Let me just save you some time. Let me just save you some work. Let me just save you some effort. Here it is. Have at it. Joy. He said, no. He said, you maintain resolve. And you do the work. Lay a stone, and then another stone, and then another stone. But I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm within you. I'm your partner. I'm your cheerleader. Do the work. So I don't know where you are this morning and what it may be that is the source of any discouragement you may be experiencing or feeling today. But I would say this to you. God is with you. God is with you. And he wants to say to you, similar to what he said